This is Just Asking Questions, a show for inquiring minds on reason.
How do Democrats define freedom? Just asking questions. I'm Zach Weissmuller, senior producer for Reason, joined by my co-host Liz Wolfe, Reason associate editor. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Zach.
It's Democratic National Convention week, so we wanted to talk about what's been unfolding there so far, the rhetoric, the thematic choices, and what it all reveals about the Democrats' 2024 agenda. And also, how should we state power skeptics and liberty appreciators view that agenda? We've invited on Jane Coaston to discuss all of that with us this week. She's a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, former politics reporter at Vox, and exhibits self-described libertarian tendencies. Jane, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we are live streaming today, so if those of you watching have any questions for us during the conversation, go ahead and drop those in the chat on YouTube or on X, and we'll do our best to get to any of the good ones later on. I'm first and foremost interested in the way that both Democrats and the GOP are running towards concepts like freedom and liberty. We had Vivek Ramaswamy on the show making his case for a libertarian mega alliance. Trump courted libertarians by showing up at their convention. Democrats haven't done that kind of direct outreach yet, but they made last night's theme all about freedom. And vice presidential candidate Tim Walz gave a speech on that theme last night. I want to start this conversation off by playing a montage we put together of Democrats talking about freedom.
Honored to have been asked to speak on tonight's theme about what matters most to me, to you, and all of us Americans: freedom.
Protecting your freedom to vote, your freedom to love who you love. And your freedom to choose.
Reproductive freedom, because in Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and the personal choices they make. And even if we wouldn't make those same choices for ourselves, we've got a golden rule: mind your own damn business. And that includes IVF and fertility treatments.
For them, freedom means that the powerful can do pretty much what they please. Whether it's fire workers trying to organize a union, or put poison in our rivers, or avoid paying taxes like everybody else has to do. Well, we have a broader idea of freedom. We believe in the freedom to provide for your family if you're willing to work hard.
Because this is a big part about what this election is about: freedom. When Republicans use the word freedom, they mean that the government should be free to invade your doctor's office. Corporations free to pollute your air and water. And banks free to take advantage of customers. But when we Democrats talk about freedom, we mean the freedom to make a better life for yourself and the people that you love. Freedom to make your own healthcare decisions. And yeah, your kids' freedom to go to school without worrying about being shot dead in the hall.
Okay, Jane, what do you think of the Democrats talking the language of freedom?
I think it is rhetorically intelligent. I think that one of the things about either convention is that the conventions are not supposed to be like, we're having a constitutional convention where we're going to hash out all these big. No, it's like an advertisement. It's an advertisement for people who are not paying that close of attention, which is kind of funny because the people who watch it on X are like politics dorks. And it's the funniest thing to like observe people on Twitter, like observing the conventions like theater critics. I'm like, go outside, get go watch a movie. I don't know. But I think it's rhetorically intelligent. I think that, and I want to separate that from like, because I'm aware that, obviously there's a lot of like policy differences that we can get into here, but I think rhetorically it is very smart to be the people who are like, we are normal moms and dads who love football, freedom, and faith, and we want to keep your freedoms intact, and these other strange people over here don't want to do that. And I think, again, rhetorically, that is a fantastic claim to make. Like, when you have thousands of people at a convention chanting USA and talking about freedom and bringing on like members of Governor Walz's former football team on stage, it genuinely, like, rhetorically and visually, I think that is effective messaging. That does not mean that it is accurate or 100% true. Just as the RNC, like, bringing on folks who are, who have, I think at the RNC, like, you see the same kind of thing of like talking about freedoms and faith and talking about how um, Democrats are standing in the way of both of those things. Like, again, it's rhetorically effective.
I think the thing that comes to mind as I watch this convention is it's all really evocative of FDR's for freedom speech, right?
Right.
There's freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Okay, I'm with you there. And then you get into freedom from want and
Freedom
freedom
from
from
fear.
fear,
Right.
which are two things that I think the DNC, like, naturally this rankles libertarians, right? Because how do you define freedom from fear, and what types of government policy or big government measures would be necessitated by that if we were trying to ensure total freedom from fear or freedom from want, right? Like, that sounds like a recipe for massive expansion of the federal government in a way that libertarians vehemently oppose. And it also feels a little bit like this weird rhetorical trick where it's like, well, freedom from want, I mean, that could encompass almost anything. How do you look at these distinctions and the ways Democrats are trying to sell the concept of freedom? Do you think this will make it so that more of their messaging is focused on this in the future? Or do you think that people are sort of onto them where they're like, well, you can't really actually create freedom from want, nor is that really what we're talking about here?
I think that they're going to continue using this messaging. I also
Mhm.
think that like the Norman Rockwell-esque version of what freedom from want, freedom from fear, what that looks like is so appealing to people.
Mhm.
It's the same way, like, I think a lot about back in 2020, 2021, when you talked about criminal justice reform. Something that you encountered is a phenomenon that I call kind of personal libertarianism, which
Mhm.
is literally, I should be able to do whatever I want, and other people should also have to do what I want. And I think that that has always been one of the biggest challenges to widespread reforms on criminal justice, or even just basic reforms that would promote more freedom, is that people are going to be free to do things that you are we allowed to swear on this podcast?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
That you fucking hate. And I think that that has been something that has been challenging. I mean, it's challenging for Democrats and Republicans. Like, Republicans are deeply, well, I should probably more say, like, the right is deeply bothered by people doing things that they do not want them to do. Like, the
Mm.
entire new right is constructed out of people who are very upset about people doing things they do not want them to do.
And
And so,
attempting to
Yeah.
harness the power of the state, mind
yes,
you, to
yes,
ensure that those types of things don't happen, right? Which
yes,
is that
exactly.
taken to
Yeah, the
another level.
entire common good thing, like, I think a lot about how, like, the Peter Thiel kind of the new right thing, like, that there's a fantastic Vanity Fair piece on this very subject where it's just like, I like to imagine that some, like, DNC operative just read that entire thing and was like, "Okay, we go with the opposite of whatever all this is." But I think, like, I think the messaging is going to show up. The idea of being free from needing to worry about your kids being in a school shooting. Now, let's keep in mind, school shootings are actually incredibly rare.
Mhm.
However, that is like, it's one of those things, like, that doesn't help anyone. Like, being like, actually, this probably won't happen to you. It's the same thing of like, yes, that's true, but nobody wants to hear it. And so I think like that freedom from fear, freedom from want, because it even if you say things like, actually, most people aren't living paycheck to paycheck, and school shootings aren't are actually quite rare, and like the types of things that people are very worried about thematically are not actually giant, big concerns, well, it turns out nobody wants to hear that. And you sound like a dick when you say it. Like, again, it's one of those challenges in which you're like, I can recognize the reality of a situation while also being aware that selling the reality of that situation, I don't think anyone wants to do that. And so I do think that that messaging is going to be used in the future, especially because I think that people are responding to it, especially people who are like, let's keep in mind that like most Americans are not rock-ribbed ideologues. They just aren't. Like, they might have, like, 1 or 2 issues that they care a lot about, or not really, which is fine. And so I think that if you are trying to grab people and, like, people talk a lot about, like, undecided voters or independent voters as actually being committed partisans, and I don't think that's necessarily true. If you are trying to grab those people, like the people who are kind of tangential to politics but don't really get involved and generally only vote in presidential elections, if your biggest campaign point is freedom from stuff you don't like, that is very effective. Now, is it true? Probably not. But effective. Like again, we are talking about rhetorical reality, not like actual life.
Do you think that Democrats will be able to pull off this rebrand successfully, in part because people have sort of proven that politically and electorally they have weirdly short memories with regard
Oh,
to
yeah.
COVID? I
Yep.
mean, because if you think about like the weird moment we're in, like when I think about Democrats, I think about like the gun grabbers who kind of want to deny me school choice, which is like a freedom that I boy like sure would like to exercise for my own kid, and would like other people to have the ability to exercise too. And then I think about like OSHA vaccine mandates and the fact that like my beloved city, New York, was making it so that you had to get vaccinated and you had to deal with all kinds of weird capacity restrictions, and business owners had onerous restrictions put on them in order to just like participate in public life. For a while there, I'm sorry, but Democrats in blue cities and states to a far greater degree than red ones were the ones saying, actually, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And how dare you do that? And we're going to call you, you're going to be snitched on via the hotline over here. And we're going to send the cops to break up your gathering. And how dare you, try to clip the padlocks on a playground. Like for a while there in 2020, 2021, and a little bit of 2022, Democrats were the party of like meddlesome people trying to tell you how to live your life for your own good, frequently under the guise of kind of suspicious, not so airtight science. Have we just like totally forgotten all of this? Or is
100%.
and so it's
Yes,
just
we
like
have.
we're just fully memory holding it. And now Democrats, do you think they're leaning into the freedom messaging to try to like
You're so,
almost erase people's minds further from this and to distract and be like, nope, actually we were never the party of anti-freedom and locking you inside your houses. Now we're the freedom folks.
First and foremost, I think that we've seen, if you go back to 1918, 1919, after the Spanish flu epidemic in the United States, what you see is like 1919, 1920, gone. People didn't want to talk about it. People didn't want to think about it. Like a lot of media of that era,
Hmm.
and like from every grade, like let's keep in mind every era has its own popular culture. The popular culture of like 1919, 1920, nothing about the Spanish flu epidemic. So like this isn't new, but yes, I do think that people are memory holding COVID. I think we saw that a little bit in 2022. If you
Mhm.
recall, 2022 was supposed to be like a big red wave election.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that like even Republicans, like the governor of Ohio, who people were like very mad at about COVID, still it's Mike DeWine. Now, granted, Mike DeWine is like exceptionally boring. Like, and so I just think people are just like, fine. But like you saw this in Michigan with Gretchen Whitmer being able to basically get the trifecta in 2022 with Democrats' control of all, like basically all state organs, because you saw like the lack of backlash over COVID. And so I think that in a lot of ways also something that has happened, like the Democratic Party, I think, is sometimes treated as if it acts alone or as if it is the only actor. Um, and I think that that's really infuriating for Democrats to be like, we like people like Democrats are required to simultaneously be the adult in the room and also responsible for any and all actions. And so I think that something else that's coming up here is that a lot of Republicans, especially in state parties, responded to COVID and everything by being like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to run the fucking craziest person you've ever heard of in your entire life. Like Blake Masters, yeah, we're going to have him record an ad in the desert, just like, massaging a German gun, which he tells us is German, and then shooting it into a ravine. And then that's an ad. Congratulations. And so I think like there's been a sense that for Democrats that they can run away from COVID because people don't want to think about it. People don't want to talk about it. The people who really, really, really care about school closures and what happened in 2021 and 2022, that era, like, I think that people are taking a gamble that there aren't that many of them because they keep looking at the states where people were purportedly the maddest about it and then looking at the election results in 2022 and then even in 2023 and being like, where they go. I mean, I had a conversation with Mary Catherine Ham, who she writes for Fox and does a lot of stuff where we basically had this conversation of like, this is something that she cares about a lot. And she was pretty much like, I'm more ideological on this issue than I thought I was, and most people are not. And so I do think that Democrats are going to run away from it. Everyday people, most of them, are in that weird, like, it's not that they don't remember it. It's just like a thing you don't really want to think about too hard. Like, I was thinking, I was thinking earlier, I'm like, yeah, remember in 2020 when people were just really into sea shanties for some reason? It's on the list of like that thing that we did, the sea shanties. And so I do think that Democrats are going to run away from that issue and focus on the kind of amorphous freedom rhetoric because it's effective. And also because in places where COVID regulations were strongest, the Republican Party responded to that by running people who were bonkers. I mean, you saw that in Michigan. You saw that. I mean, you are still seeing that in Minnesota. You're seeing that in a bunch of states where Republicans could have run someone who responded to COVID by talking about the need for limited government and the need for thinking through the impacts of policies on kids and what that would mean and thinking about what Sweden did. And anyway, and that's not what happened. Now, that is in part the GOP primary process. That is a different problem. But I do think that they are going to be able to move away from COVID because everybody wants to move away from COVID. Even like people are still getting COVID, for the record, and we are obviously not in like peak pandemic and blah 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 blah. But like the degree to which everybody just kind of like, nope, we're moving on, and like, yeah, people, a massive tragic event that happened to millions of people and impacted their lives in ways that they do not 100% understand. There's been a lot of talk about how like, and I'm not sure if you both feel that this way, that like COVID changed how we all aged. Like, there's like this weird, like, there are moments in which I genuinely forget how old I am. And then I'm like, oh yeah, there was this like weird 2-year break where something happened. Like, it's a weird phenomenon.
Does that add years or take years off your life? Like, you feel younger or older?
Oh, I feel younger than I probably actually am. And it's weird.
Yeah.
I have no explanation
You're
for
just
this.
had arrested development for 2 years. Well, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you that COVID, there's this amnesia that is unfortunately, I think, on both sides actually, because I am in that Mary Catherine Hand camp of like, yeah, I actually care about these policies and think that we need to learn from the mistakes and that there was a lot of authoritarianism that and bad precedents that were set that need to be accounted for. If that was the mood, even on the Republican side, I don't think Donald Trump would be the nominee because he was running the executive branch during that time. And there were other people in the primary who would have been the more COVID accountability type of candidate, and they didn't get any traction. But I also, I do agree. I also agree with you that the Democrats embracing this message of freedom is a rhetorically smart move. The part where I think that the COVID hangover might still linger is it's not so conscious, but it's a little bit like when you're saying we're for freedom to choose your own healthcare, for instance, it kind of, in some people, just triggers this instinct of like, well, wait, weren't you the party of vaccine mandates? Like there's something that is triggered there that is like, it doesn't quite hit as hard as it used to in, pre 2020. But it is nice to have Democrats embracing freedom as a value. I think
Mhm.
it says something encouraging about the political moment that they're trying to speak that language, because it feels like freedom. Freedom is a word that they've been scoffing at for decades now, to be honest. Like it got a really bad rap during COVID. You had celebrities out there literally saying, fuck your freedoms. And now
Mhm.
we're giving freedom a big hug again, and like embracing
Yeah.
this really foundational American concept, which I think it is good. But there is a kind of hollowness to it for me, especially because they're going on these long soliloquies, kind of defining freedom in this very specific Democrat way that in some ways jibes with how I look at freedom, but in other ways doesn't, in the same ways that Liz was outlining there when you're talking
Mhm.
about guaranteeing some sort of standard of living or type of school or pro union law. Um, any of these things might have their merits, but they're not exactly freedom, which is, why liberty might be the more useful political concept here, because then you're talking about freedom from instead of freedom to do things. But clearly it's being contested, and there are some differences in how people think about freedom. I thought, there's no objective way to measure it, but that hasn't stopped the Cato Institute from trying to measure it. And I was looking at their freedom in the 50 states index, and how they've basically separated economic freedom and personal freedom, and then synthesized those into overall freedom. And you find states like California, where Kamala Harris hails from, ranked 48. Minnesota, where Tim Walz hails from, ranked 41. Bottom of the barrel type of freedom rankings. Although interestingly, when you go to Cato's rankings of personal freedoms, a lot of that flips, and you've got California at 11 and Minnesota in 20, and states like Texas at 50 and Florida at 22. And when they're looking at personal freedoms, they're talking about things like incarceration, gambling, gun rights, tobacco freedom, marriage freedom, alcohol freedom. So I'm wondering if this is really the disconnect. We as libertarians like to look at things as freedom as a unified concept, and it may be that the parties are just not willing to tie these two concepts
Right.
together, and you've got to make you've got to pick your poison.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that it's been interesting because I recently have moved. I keep moving. So I moved from DC to Utah, and then from Utah currently in California. And I'm a noted fan of every American state and every American city. America, it rules, except for Deer Park, Ohio, but it knows what it did. But I do think that is the divide. The divide of personal liberties of, like, I now live in a state with legal and very legal marijuana, for example. Utah does not have legal marijuana. I believe it might have medical marijuana, but the regulations were onerous, as I,
Mhm.
I, I believe you would understand. Um, and Utah also has like very strict alcohol regulations, for totally understandable reasons, given what Utah is. And so I do think that divide and you were talking about the divide of between freedom from and freedom to do. And I
Yeah.
think the idea, if you're just thinking about it rhetorically, the freedom to go to do a thing or to marry a person or to be a part of something or not be a part of something, to go to church or not to go to church. Um, I think that is something that is very effective and especially very effective for many Democrats, I would say. I keep thinking about my parents, who are like diehard Democrats, have been forever. And I think about the ways that, they are in Ohio. And I remember as a kid in the early 1990s how they were responding to, um, so you have, Bill Clinton wins the presidency, but Ohio's still very conservative. And Ohio in Cincinnati, there just kept being ballot issues that were just basically like, you are not allowed to have non-discrimination regulations. You are not allowed to do these things. Like, you are not allowed to, it would be ideal if you're just not allowed to be a specific type of liberal in Ohio. We would just prefer you weren't.
Mm.
And my parents very much valued the freedom to be a interracial couple in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Very much valued the freedom to support their friends who were gay and lesbian, especially in the 80s and 90s. And they felt as if the Republicans of Ohio were attempting to stop them from doing so. And
Mhm.
then you get to, I have a side point about wherever you're living, I find whoever is the dominant politics of that place tends to be the people that you're most annoyed by.
Oh yeah.
And so when I moved, when I lived in DC, DC is obviously overwhelmingly Democratic. And I spent a lot of time being annoyed by the Democratic Party and the kind of Democratic operatives of DC. Then I moved to
Mhm.
Utah and I was like, oh God, I long for the Democratic operatives of DC. Like, when you have Spencer Cox, who people in, like, some of the Republicans in Utah talked about Spencer Cox like he was a goddamn tanky. And then you're like, this guy? Really? And so now that I've moved to California, I'm like, I wonder when it's gonna come that I'm just annoyed all the time at Democrats. And I'm sure it
I
will.
feel this way 100% of the time because I think I read as more conservative than I perhaps am, just because I'm a New Yorker. And so I'm filled with ambient rage at this idea of like, ooh, the
Yeah.
liberals are making my life worse all the time. Especially I have to fork over taxes for, the state, but also for the city. Like it feels like at every
Yeah.
level, I have
No,
reasons
I,
to
I
hate
have a whole I have a whole thesis on how so many people's politics are based on like, I live here and the dominant whatever is so annoying to me. And I'm like, if you just move, I wonder if you just move to like, if super, super liberal people move who are annoyed by other liberals move to like rural Oklahoma. I'm not sure how they would do it. But anyway, um I do think that personal freedom from divide is so important to understand, because
Mhm.
the idea, and I think it also gets in how
But
people
Jane, when you're
perceive
talking
government.
about the
Yeah.
when in that example you gave of the freedom to do this, to be in
Mhm.
an interracial
Yeah.
relationship, that's still we're talking about the government not interfering in a
Right.
private. So it's
No,
freedom from
this is not a
right?
clean,
Yeah,
easy,
yeah,
this is not a clean, easy, like the government here, the government there.
sure,
It's, Loving versus Virginia. The Supreme Court had to rule on this issue because the state
yeah,
kept telling people you were not allowed to do this, and we're very mad at you. And so
mhm,
it's obvious it's not a clean example. The freedom from, freedom to divide is not a clean government free, government full example. But I'm just thinking about it in
mhm,
terms of how people are perceiving what they are and are not allowed to do, or what they perceive that they are being told that they are not allowed to do. Um, I think about this a lot in kind of online rhetoric. This idea of like, these woke scolds are telling me I can't say this. And then you like look up who it is. It's like, it's some lady who writes for the New Yorker. Like, come on. Like, that's, when I think about this a lot when people get very, or, and I've talked about this elsewhere, but when people conflate private power and public power,
Mm.
where it's like, I'm more bothered by old Twitter telling me I couldn't do something than I am by like the state of Georgia telling me I can't do something. And I'm like, well, one of those people
yeah,
has guns. So
yeah.
like,
I guess the reason I
in
like
general, I'm
linger
more
on it,
worried about the
yeah.
gun person, but like, whatever.
Yeah, the reason I linger on it a little bit is because, there's that the rhetoric there in that opening clip is often like there for freedom for big companies to roll over you and pollute everywhere, and we're for your freedom to do what you want with your body. And I think there's a little bit of an artificial distinction here, because when you're talking about environmental regulations, for instance, like we want to have people should pay for their own pollution and so forth. That is part of freedom, is having some responsibility. But then, the way the EPA is regulated over the past several decades and is now being rolled back by the Supreme Court, the way that manifests often is like, I did a documentary about the Sackett case where it's like a couple trying to build
Zach,
property.
you are thinking about this so much harder than how most people do.
I'm going
Like,
to
again,
do it by getting
Like,
to
why are they considering the Sackett case? What the hell?
No, this is like when
Yeah.
I'm like, no, like Section 230, the
Yeah.
Communications Decency Act is actually incredibly important, and here is the many reasons why you should not like. Yeah, I know. Again,
My point is, this is just one couple getting
No.
rolled by the federal government because they're
repeatedly
defining like a
happens.
totally dry lot of land as
No,
wetlands.
as repeatedly happens, and like we could think
Right.
about this. Like, yes, absolutely, 100%. But rhetorically, I think it's important to remember that, like, especially because I think that Democrats are, and I'm going to do the thing that I hate doing, and I believe I'm about to engage in like punditry. Ugh, disgusting.
Let's go.
Like,
I'm rubbing
That's
my hands.
illegal in Utah.
Fortunately, I moved to California.
Do you have a
What-
license for that? Yeah.
Yeah, in California.
Governor Newsom, I'm gonna need that punditry license. So I am not saying what I'm about to say is good or bad. I am saying that I think it is rhetorically intelligent. It
Mhm.
is good, rhetorically intelligent, for Democrats to make these people are just for the fat cats argument. Every election of my life. Now, granted, I feel like I had a lot, I should have really enjoyed being like a small child more and paid more attention to like the 92 and 96 elections, because like now in hindsight, I'm like, God, that must have been normal. But I mean, it wasn't. Whatever. Nothing has ever been normal. But like the rhetoric of we are for everyday working folks, they are for globalist, fat cat, whatevers. Very effective. Works all the time. Like, even, I mean, it's been funny because today you've seen some people who are like, why do they keep going after JD Vance for going to Yale? Like, that's so rude. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I've been alive for long enough to recall the evil elites going to the evil elite institutions being responsible for every problem that we have ever had. And now it's like, oh, poor Mr. Yale. Yeah, come on. And so I think that, again, it's not that deep. Like, the idea of we are for everyday normal people doing what they want to do and taking care of their families, while they are for rich assholes. I mean, that was the entire 2012 campaign, wasn't it? Like, this rich asshole wants to just take away your jobs and ride in a big plane, and this nice
Strap a
person
dog
wants
to
to help
his
you.
roof.
Yeah, like what binders, whatever. Now, again, was all of that like 100% on the level? Of course it wasn't. But again, punditry.
Yeah.
It was effective. Not good, not bad, but effective. And so I think, like, yes, obviously, environmental regulations can be onerous. And we actually got like a little bit of YIMBYism, which like it was very funny because like YIMBY Twitter was like, oh my God. And I'm like, wow, you guys have been out in the wilderness for too long. But like the idea of like, onerous regulations stopping people from building homes. I'm like, yeah, that's an obvious thing that we should do something about. Like, yes, obviously. But I do think that rhetoric is good.
Hold on, Zach.
I want to play the Obama YIMBY clip, and then I know Liz has a follow-up question, but just to show what you're talking about there, Liz or Jane.
We can't just rely on the ideas of the past. We need to chart a new way forward to meet the challenges of today. And Kamala understands this. She knows, for example, that if we want to make it easier for more young people to buy a home, we need to build more units and clear away some of the outdated laws and regulations that made it harder to build homes for working people in this country. That is a priority, and she's put out a bold new plan to do just that.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really interesting here that I think we're all circling around is the fact that the Democrats, for quite a few years now, have been the party of meddlesome busybodies at best, or at worst, authoritarians. The thing that's been really interesting is they've also been, I think, the far left progressive wing has pulled the party so much in this identity politics direction in a way that I think isn't especially salient for normal people and for people who are a little bit politically disengaged, for swing voters. So one thing that we've kind of seen this DNC is a little bit of this correction, and I don't think it's an overcorrection. I think it's probably a warranted correction to being like, we are moms and dads. Boy, do we like football. Boy, do we like freedom and hope and joy. And like they've managed to pull off, I think, a very successful rebrand. And, pundits keep criticizing Harris for being very light on the policy specifics. Okay, but like they're running, at least thus far, a vibes campaign, a positive campaign, an uplifting thing. Oprah's on stage, like it's so tonally different than the Democratic Party that we have all been following for the past roughly 8 years at this point, since basically the rise of Trump. And Trump as this sort of perceived or real existential threat. The sort of public enemy number one, Trump. They've long sort of been positioning themselves in full extreme opposition to Trump and sounding the alarms. And now there's a little bit of like the sense of, we've sounded the alarms. Now we will also articulate some of the things that we are, positive on, the things that we are hopeful for. And I think that that's been really successful. But at the same time, Democrats have still like let their freak flags fly in some weird ways. And I'm curious to know what you think of the sort of efficacy of this approach. Like I'm thinking specifically about like, it's really easy to sort of roast the vasectomy bans and the abortion bans and the inflatable IUD. And I understand that their, reproductive rights is in full focus this election. And it makes a lot of sense why this would be the case. But to some degree, there's a little bit of like must we really do an inflatable IUD? Like, is this the way to seem like exceedingly normal and well adjusted? Jane, how do you think this plays with like, I don't know, folks in Indiana who like football a lot?
Well, if you're a person in Indiana who likes football a lot, that means you've been exposed to a lot of either IU and Notre Dame football or the Indianapolis Colts. So good luck, Godspeed. Hope all that works out for you.
I am thinking of a placeholder football fan.
Sorry, I was about to get very specific about Notre Dame football, and no one needs all of that. Marcus Freeman seems cool though. Anyway, I think that
Democratic Party indulging some of its like, worst temptations to be like a little freaky and out there, or does it play well?
Okay. Speaking as myself, I don't know. I actually, I try not to, and I hope I try to limit the amount that I attempt to prognosticate as to how other people are going to view something. Because in like 2015, 2016, when Donald Trump came around, I was like, wow, this guy seems like a giant asshole. And then it turns out lots of other people were like, wow, this guy's awesome. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't understand what a lot of people are into. I will say, though, that the way in which it's been interesting, because I think that the thing about the debates around abortion and reproductive freedom writ large have played out, I think that there's a sense of like, for Democrats, they've seen how these ballot issues have gone in like traditionally reddish states.
Kansas
and Kentucky,
very revealing.
And like, you're seeing what's happening in Florida and Trump like tap dancing away from it in a way that is amusing to me. And you see that the number of people who are like, we should use the Comstock Act. And I'm like, look, you should not get excited about Comstock. That's not a good idea. And so I do think that there is two Democrats, in my view, this is just me, person sitting here, a little bit more rhetorical freedom around that specific issue, because it's not the same. Like I'm aware that people have been very turned off by kind of the shout your abortion and that kind of thing. But I think that post Dobbs, you had the pro-life movement, and I've said this repeatedly, pro-life movement is the dog that caught the car on this particular issue. And I think that there's still so much weird wrangling over this issue on the right, the pro-life right, because I'm aware like there are conservatives who are pro-choice. It's people are allowed to do whatever they're into, and so I think that, to me, that like, especially because that was taking place at the DNC, but people were not like bringing an IUD on the stage. I think that there is a little bit more, or viewed to be a little bit more, rhetorical space around that issue.
Hmm.
because they have seen in election after election after election that actually people are increasingly more supportive of abortion rights. Because again, it's one of those things that you don't know what you have until it's gone. Or it's an issue that people didn't really think they needed to care that much about. And then suddenly we're like, oh, actually, I care quite a bit. And so I do think that is something that I could see Democrats thinking like, we've got a little more space on this particular issue, especially when we believe that we have an opposition that can't quite keep its story straight on what it wants. Like the idea, like you get to talking about birth control and fertility and things like that. And you have some Republicans who are like, absolutely, we want to protect birth control. And then you have a bunch of other Republicans who are like, no, no, we don't. We absolutely do not want that. Please read our lengthy paper on how birth control is causes abortions and how we hate it. And we are all going to wrangle on this issue. So I do think that there's a sense of like, on that, there's a little bit more space. But I want to go back actually to something that you were talking about with regard to how people, again, this is all about rhetoric. What people are actually going to do, the policy, the stuff that I'm really interested in. Like politics is the road to policy. Sometimes people get really focused on the road for whatever reason. But like what you were saying about how people sounded, there have been a couple of great pieces comparing how AOC gave her speech in 2020 and how AOC gave her speech in 2024. And her speech in 2020 was much more like jargony. And in 2024, it's much more like everyday normal people doing everyday normal things. And so I do think that there's been a rhetorical shift away from academic language within the Democratic Party. And it's been interesting because you see on the right, especially the new right, the quote unquote new right, where there's been a shift towards a type of language that is very like, no one made JD Vance use the word perimenopausal. Now, the word perimenopausal is not a bad word, but the moment you start using that type of language, people are going to be like, what? Why? And so like it's been interesting because I wrote a piece in 2020 saying like the Trump campaign was too online. And I don't mean online as in like using the internet. I mean like going on the stump to yell about Section 230 or about Bruce and Nellie Orr, who I remember I writing that piece being like, who the hell are these people? And then I had to look up a piece I had written like 6 months earlier because apparently my brain did not want to remember who Bruce and Nellie Orr were. But like you see that a little bit now on the right. And you see that especially with Vance. Like there is a degree to which how online he is and like kind of where he is has seemed to have gotten a lot of his ideas and how the online right, which is very influential, talks about certain ideas. Like they've gotten more online while Democrats who are, let's be clear, very online all the time are like it's like someone somewhere is just being like, shut the fuck up about the internet. Like, don't talk like this. Like, sound normal. Normal.
We talked about broadband access for America, and I'm a little bit like, actually, no broadband access for literally everyone. The right, the left, you're all banned.
Yeah, we gotta go on dial-up.
Yeah.
Enough. Go learn your mom's dial-up password. We're going back.
We had Nate Silver on here a couple of weeks. I think he was describing Vance as having sort of the soul of a blogger, and that's a very bad thing for politics because he's just like delved into all these worlds and then things
which
like
it's good to delve into good to delve into worlds, but you got to leave the worlds behind when you were like attempting to talk to everybody.
Yeah, and I think he said, I think it was Eric Weinstein who said perimenopausal in a podcast interview with him, and it's like I am very entertained by Eric Weinstein, but if your VP is sitting down for hour-long podcast with them, you're already in trouble.
Yeah, this I mean, this is a side point. But if there's anything we've learned from JD Vance, it's don't go on every podcast because they keep being like this uncovered podcast. And I'm like, one, it wasn't uncovered. You just like Googled it. And two, it'll be like, oh, you were not legally required to do a podcast with the guy who Rod Dreher thought was too weird. And if you don't know who Rod Dreher is, like when
He's
he
in a
thinks,
Hungarian bathhouse right now.
yeah,
You'll
he's in the Hungarian bathhouse being like, wow, this guy's a freak. Like, come on.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that really, I'm aware I'm saying this on a podcast, but sometimes you don't need to do
Yeah.
like every podcast.
He
Yeah,
who is
but
without
is-
Hungarian bathhouse friends, Cassie Stone.
But I don't know. Is there a sense in which he's actually just kind of on the frontier here, or I don't know, the sacrificial lamb in a way, like as the millennials start running for higher office,
Mhm.
like they're going to have been on podcasts. Trump is doing he just did a Theo Von podcast, so
You learned
it's
about
like
Coco.
this is where things are headed, and we maybe are just
Yeah.
sort of adapting to it and are going to be a little more forgiving of the weirdness that comes out.
I mean, I think it's not just about going on podcasts. I think it
Yeah.
is about so something that I have always found very, to me, troubling about the so-called new right and also like the far left
Mhm.
is I fucking love this country. Like I think it's really, really awesome. Like you
Mhm.
go in so many different places. And whether that's like Manhattan or like Xenia, Ohio, or whether it's, the lakes of Wisconsin or, Utah and going into the Wasatch, like it's awesome and great and could get better, but like it's pretty awesome and has progressively my entire life has gotten better. And I think that's great. And the way in which the far left, which I think people were very aware of in like 2019, 2020, 2021, the like era of like abolish police, America is over, we hate death to America, which I'm like, unless you're
Mhm.
Ice Cube, you really can't pull that off. The way they talked about America, I think really turned off me and turned off a lot of people who were like, actually, it's pretty cool here. Especially, when you have, it's the same thing of like when people compare America negatively to like Nordic countries, and you're like, well, it's way bigger and doesn't have a king and isn't a Nordic country. This also
We
bothers
let
me.
in
Like,
actual immigrants, right? Like we
yeah,
have like, diversity.
yeah,
We have
yeah.
that
Yeah, and also, our population is like huge. Like it's a
Yeah.
huge big country that's very different, and if there like I always talk about how like if there's something in America that you don't like, believe me, there's somewhere you could go where you'd never see it again. Whatever it is. But and then the right took that on and we're like, actually, we also hate America. We hate everything about it. We hate democracy and we hate liberalism. Not like liberals, like classical liberalism. And we're very, very mad about it. And we're gonna write a lot of books about it that I will at some point have attempted to read, and I'm like, ugh. But the way in which the kind of new right, and I don't mean
Mhm.
like everyday conservatives or just every Republican voter, the way in which the new right talks about how America is over. The people who were like, the worst thing that ever happened in America was the Civil Rights Act. Like, you're like, no, no, that what, no, 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 no,
Yeah.
that's just a big no. And so I think that the way in which Vance has engaged with and discussed America in this like fallen, desperate times, like kind of like the Flight 93 election, but just
Mhm.
forever all the time.
Yeah.
That is something
American
that I think,
carnage everywhere and always.
yeah,
Yeah.
that like everywhere is terrible. You can't do anything without just getting murdered or something like that. And I
Yeah.
think that I mean, I'm aware that there is like a negativity bias to media and how we talk about things. Like no one wants to say that like crime has gone down even though it has gone down because apparently that's mean. I don't get it. But like I think that it's not just like the podcast because like I've been on a lot of podcasts, but I will never run for office because I find most people incredibly irritating. But it is the sense that he engaged in a very deeply siloed version of idea making and discussion in which like talking a lot about how terrible childless people are. It's like really
Yeah.
common. And it's like it's something it's been funny because he keeps trying to have to explain it to wider audiences. And I'm like, no, like this is a very common viewpoint among
Yeah.
this specific group of people. Like if you're like a
Yeah.
big like if you read Tacky, or if you read like a lot, the people who are very concerned about noticing racial differences or something like that, like all of those people are very like the way they talk about birth rates in a way that just makes me go, "Ugh, I don't like where this is
Mhm.
going." Like I love kids, but I don't like where this is. I think that that is the concern. Um, I would say that it's been interesting as a fellow millennial, like watching people being like, "Oh, look at his awkward Facebook photos." I'm like, "Ho ho
Yeah.
ho,
Oh,
buddy,
yeah.
you don't
We've
you
all
don't
got
even
them.
you don't even want to know." Like, I'm sure
Yeah.
you might remember that like weird moment in like towards when you like were about to graduate from college, where everyone started deleting or untagging themselves from photos because they were like, "Oh,
Yes.
I have to go get a job now."
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a sense that it's not just being on podcasts or something like that. It is
Mhm.
about engaging, like wrapping yourself up with and doing a big yes and game with people whose version of America is such that America has failed them specifically. They hate it. They will not be happy until
Yeah.
something changes in such a big way that America would become unrecognizable, and until then, they are furious all the time, which
Ye
no regardless of where that's coming from, nobody likes that. Like,
Yeah.
it's
There's
like the same
also
people
something.
who got really mad about, like, who say, like, sports ball. Like,
Mhm.
nobody likes that.
There's also
Yeah.
something quite disturbing about the types of things that a lot of this new right sort of feels the need to attack. Like you think about, for example, no fault divorce. You talk about IVF, and there's a few things where it's kind of like, I don't know, man. Was there actually a significant constituency in the United States that was kind of like calling for a rollback of these things? Like, I mean, there's a few ultra devout Catholics who are like very opposed to IVF, but frequently aren't really looking to change the laws, to overhaul the laws, to attempt to get everyone to live in accordance with our faith, right? Because it's mine, not necessarily shared with by other people.
What,
And so
you're not a big Catholic integralist trying to get us all to live under Mother
yeah,
Church?
turns out
Weird.
no. I think it's ideally better when people shift to a religious belief that they authentically believe versus living under a theocratic state that attempts to force it.
Or doing, like,
Uh,
sort of a
like,
performative thing in which they
yeah,
become a
and
cultural Christian to
it's always converts too, right? Like there's like a chip on their shoulder. But no, I think there's something really disturbing about the fact that like they just seemingly cannot help themselves, and there's a sense of like, oh, we need to like pick at these issues which, you know, up until now were really not things that people were debating in the public sphere. There wasn't a significant constituency that was calling to overturn this or to wield the power of the state to change this was just kind of not something that was on anyone's radar until like the freaking Adrian Vermeule's sort of circle began to decide that it mattered a lot. And I think it's a very noxious thing that that we're noticing from this group. And you know, all of us have been plugged into the existence of this type of new right thinker and personality for quite a while. But I think now with JD Vance coming onto the national stage in such a major way, now more and more people are realizing just how insane a lot of this stuff is. And I think it's just like it's interesting watching Republicans in this moment sort of fumbling the ball where it could be like, oh, you are attempting to appeal to like people's fears about crime and safety. People sense that actually, you know, the sort of chaos at the southern border is not something that, you know, has a stamp of approval for most voters. Most people, most normal people, even normal Democrats are rubbed the wrong way by it and want a more orderly system for people to enter. Like there's a bunch of issues that Republicans could ostensibly be running on right now. And instead, they're choosing to go after some of the absolute most batshit things that kind of nobody was asking for. But I wonder whether in normal, moderate Americans' minds, whether the fact that Dobbs being overturned, or the fact that the Roe being overturned by Dobbs, the fact that that actually happened now leads to them being like, I wonder what other things could possibly be gone after. Right.
right.
Like that seemed
I
unthinkable, but now the unthinkable has entered the Overton window. And so who
yeah.
knows?
Yeah, I have 2
Possible.
points on that. One is that, purity spirals are really, really dangerous. They're
Yeah.
really, really dangerous, and we saw this a little bit, and you're seeing Democrats responding to this because I think in 2020, 2021, you had a lot of people, like, they're just kind of all like, "Well, anything's possible." I think that that's one of the funny, unexpected things about, Trump's rise is that people got this idea like, "Oh, anything can happen. Anything's possible. We can do full communism. We can all become fascist." Like, no, no, like, gravity still matters. Like, it's still a thing. Like, we still exist. Like, the playing field has not changed that much. And so I think that you saw on the left this idea, and among Democrats, that like there could not be any guardrails against the further left, because the more left you were, the more like that must mean that you are more correct or more accurate. Like, there's always been not always, but like kind of since I would say the early 1990s, 2000s, like the kind of slur against centrism or neoliberalism or pretty much anything that ends in an ism, with regard to politics. And so I think that there was a sense in like 2020, 2019, 2020 that like actually like we should just be moving further to the left. There's need to be no guardrails. Rioting is something that you need to be thinking about in terms of like, the political correctness and utility of aforementioned riots. And then you have people living in communities that had been impacted by riots being like, actually, this all fucking sucked and we all hated it and it was bad. And I think that what you see now, to some degree of effectiveness, is Democrats ruthlessly correcting and attempting to separate themselves from their furthest left flank. They are helped by the fact that the furthest left flank hates Democrats. Like, I mean, you've seen this in some of the protests in Chicago, in which the people who are like, Kamala Harris is trying to foment a Holocaust or something like that. Like, these are not people who are going to eventually vote for this particular platform. Like, that they're just not. That's just not what's going to happen. That has actually been something I think that has been to the benefit of Democrats, is that the people further left of Democrats genuinely hate Democrats, like a whole lot. Like they're like, like Trump is bad, but like Joe Biden is the most evil figure who has ever acted, which are like, wow.
It's like how libertarians act toward other libertarians, right? Like it's not the Republicans or the Democrats that are bad. No. It's the libertarian who believes that one thing ever so slightly differently than you. And how dare they say so?
You got to fight them. You got to fight them in the streets. But to that point, I think that what we're seeing on the right now, and I talked about this a lot, is that like there are no guardrails against the new right or against saying like, and it's been interesting because I think that like I've argued for a long time that there was no real such thing as Trumpism, that people just projected a lot of stuff onto him and he was smart in saying like, sure, whatever, go with it. And so what you've seen now is that there's nobody to be like, actually, we will 100% not go after birth control. We will not go after IVF or reproductive fertility mechanisms. We will not do that, because there's always some guy who is going to be the more like true con, like the more conservative than you, who is like, actually, we should make condoms illegal. And like in this particular iteration of the Republican Party, the guy who wants to make condoms illegal and the person who is like, the somewhat pro-choice Republican, one is believed to be clearly more correct than the other. And I think that that's always the challenge of purity spirals, is that purity spirals, like the further you go into it, the more like people are going to be telling you like you're correct and good and based, which as a side note, I still don't really know what based means. But I think that is this ongoing issue of trying to chase the furthest right, while most people are like really turned off by that. And I think that that's something like it's a challenge, because you cannot, the people who, and especially on the issue of abortion, if you have people who have been told for 50 years, we are fighting to abolish abortion. We believe that abortion is murder. We believe it is evil. And then you go back to those same people who are like, good news, we're going to give you a 12-week abortion ban. It's the same laws as France. Like, they were not fighting for French abortion law. Like, people did not, do everything they've done for 50 years for French abortion law. And so I think that's the real challenge in some ways of like, you can't really police the right flank if you also believe the right flank is morally correct. And that's why I think, to the second point about like the Overton window moving on Roe and on a bunch of other issues, is that we are naturally a suspicious and conspiratorial people, Americans. It is one of our more annoying and also kind of awesome qualities. After like years of being told that Roe is settled law, which, like, whatever that means. Roe is then overturned. And then you have people who are like the same people who wanted Roe overturned but kept saying it was settled law are like, yay, Roe's been overturned, the thing I've always wanted. And then those same people are like, well, obvious Obergefell's settled law. Like, it would just be too hard to overturn it. And then you're like, but that's what you just said. Now, I'm aware these are very different issues. Like, Obergefell's 2015, that's like far more recent, like Roe 1973. Like, you've got 50 years of working on this particular issue. But I do think, to Liz's point, like, there is a sense of like, is everything on the table? Because you can always find somebody, Clarence Thomas might have said it in a dissent, or like, you can always find somebody who's prominent enough to be like, yeah, actually, we should make marriage equality illegal again, or something like that. There's always going to be somebody, and that's one of the challenges you have. There's like this idea called nut picking, which is like, you find the craziest person on that opposes you on an issue, and you lift them up to be like, obviously, everyone who opposes this issue is like this asshole.
Mhm.
Now, that is very effective. It is somewhat different if you're nut picking and you are the person you are nut picking is like running a high level government official in a major state or something like that. That's a little bit different than like some lady did an NPR article. Like, obvious, like
Yeah.
power structures are very different. But I do think that there's a sense from a lot of people, and I think that that's why like the Project 2025 stuff has been more effective than I thought it would be, because nobody believes that Donald Trump, no matter how many times he's like, oh, I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about that, which I'm like, one, like, yeah, you do. But also, like, no, like, there are lots of people within that document who helped write that document who are the same people who would be hired to a Trump administration who are like, we're going to ban pornography because it makes our kids trans, and we're going to do all of this stuff. And like, obviously, I think that they would want to do that. And being told like, no, 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 it would just be too hard to do that. Like, that's not very effective.
So, I mean, that's a good explanation of the right's inability to police their most socially conservative wing,
Who's always been mad at them, to be clear. Like, that's been
yeah,
something, you saw this after the Bostock Supreme Court case, where social conservatives have, for the last 8, 10, 12 years, like, post-Bush, have genuinely felt like they keep being used. They keep being
yeah,
like, "Oh, we're gonna do this thing, and then we'll get these judges, and then you can have everything you want." And then
mhm.
if those judges don't rule in the way they want them to, they're like, "What did I do all this for?" And so I think, like, that's the, like, three-legged stool of modern conservatism has always been, like, a little rickety.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it got ugly to a whole new level post 2016 when everyone who wasn't going along with it is a conservative,
Right.
or you're, part of David French's, prancing fleet of effeminate men or something like that. But then, like on the Democratic side, you seem to be arguing that they've done a fairly good job of policing aspects of their left flank. I mean,
I would say,
obviously,
like, I
these
think that, I mean, it's always, no one can have a perfect window into how a policing effort is going in this front, because you can, like, there will always be somebody who's like, I want to blow up every dam in America or something like that. But I
right.
do think my view is that, like, especially at this DNC, and especially in kind of the outward focus, there has been an effort to be like, we are going to even if we are liberal, we are going to
Yeah.
seem like liberal who owns the coffee shop down the street from you and is really nice to you. Like, that
Right.
there's like a way in which this is being performed. Now, again, like,
Yeah.
I want to be
And
clear
I
that
mean,
that's not necessarily, yeah, yeah,
I mean, I agree with you that to the degree that, I mean, especially on the Gaza issue, they have been marginalized. The protest that was supposed to be there was nowhere near the numbers it
right.
was, promised to be. Kamala Harris has, been on camera chastising people for interrupting her. The economic left is somewhat marginalized, although Kamala
I mean,
did
I think,
propose
yeah, I think that
price
that's been
caps on groceries.
yeah, I think that's
Um,
also been a thing because I think both campaigns have just been like, "Fuck economists.
yeah,
We don't need
and then
you."
yeah,
It's exactly
exactly.
the
Which is
opposite, by
very,
the way,
which
of
is
what how
that's really the most alarming thing about the moment we're in to me. But that's a totally
No,
different
we're
show.
definitely in
Uh,
a, the pizza and ice cream for everybody 6th grade presidency kind of thing,
yes,
which, like, totally understand. I'm aware that, like,
yeah,
rolling up to this particular race and this particular vibe with, like, a lot of policy prescriptions, like, I keep
right.
thinking about how, like, when Elizabeth Warren ran, she was like, "I've got a plan for that on every issue," and people are like, "We just
Yeah.
don't care.
I
We just
remember
Well,
don't
the
as a
care."
problem is,
grader being annoyed by that, like, student body association, like, method of running for a campaign. So imagine my dismay to become an adult and to be watching, a presidential election to lead our actual country and to see that the exact same principle is in play
Oh,
once,
yeah.
right?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
it's an enduring thing of, like,
yeah.
IDK promised people free stuff for forever, and maybe they'll buy it, and then sometimes it'll get overturned by the courts, but, like, whatever.
Yeah.
To me, it's such a brain dead way of doing things, but it's apparently extraordinarily, appealing to people.
I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
I almost wish that we were in that sort of mode where we were getting a steady stream of policies. It kind of feels like
Yeah.
with Kamala like speed running the nomination and everything, we're just trying to figure out what a Kamala 2024 agenda would look like because she was slotted in here at
Mhm.
the last minute. But what I wanted to ask you about the policing of the
Mhm.
left is there's the, I guess we could call, social justice aspect of the
Mhm.
left, and that is what really blew up during the pandemic, and
Mhm.
I think created a lot of the backlash, and that is what I'm most skeptical that the Democrats are going to be able to dial back the excesses of. We did see Barack Obama sort of, he in his speech there was a moment where it was almost like he was saying like, can we go back to like the Obama years and be a little more chill about all this stuff? I'd like to just roll that clip,
Mhm.
and I'm very curious what your reaction to that moment was,
Mhm.
Jane, and what it says about the future of the social justice left.
Mhm.
We need to remember that we've all got our blind spots and contradictions and prejudices, and that if we want to win over those who aren't yet ready to support our candidates, we need to listen to their concerns and maybe learn something in the process. After all, if a parent or grandparent occasionally says something that makes us cringe, we don't automatically assume they're bad people. We recognize that the world is moving fast, that they need time and maybe a little encouragement to catch up. Our fellow citizens deserve the same grace we hope they'll extend to us. That's how we can build a true Democratic majority.
Now, I will note that Obama was sounding he was maybe the only person sounding that note on stage, as far as I could tell. I mean, even his
And
wife
it's
was kind of calling the opposition a bunch of racists and misogynists. But
I mean,
yeah, what was your reaction to the Obama moment?
I would say first and foremost, if you're Michelle Obama and you basically have had for the last 14, 15 years a bunch of people yelling about how your husband didn't come from America and how you're a man, I think it's okay if
Hmm.
you got a little upset. Like, I think that's
Right.
I'm gonna give her that one. Especially I like the people, like there was, I'm sure it's Fox News, so they have to perform whatever it is. People are like, "Oh, why are they so mean to Donald Trump?" And I'm like, the meanest person? The guy whose whole bag is the mean person? He's mean. That's the whole thing. Like whenever he does like something really nice or something like that, everybody's like, "Oh." Anyway, one, I think Obama's been doing the kind of like come to reason dad thing for like a really long time.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think that's been something like he's, the person who's been talking a little bit about like cancel culture, however he sees that. Um, I would also say that one of the challenges is that as someone who has long supported criminal justice reform, and like, the end of qualified immunity and a host of other issues, I think 2020 was really hard for a lot of people on that issue, because the people, I kept joking about how it was like, do you remember that exhibit show on MTV, Pimp My Ride? And it'd be
Yeah, of course.
like, you said you wanted to be able to eat in your car, so I put a fucking toaster in the engine or something like that. And so you saw in 2020
The
people
good
like,
old
okay,
days.
like, oh, so you want a limit to over policing. So we're gonna call for the abolishment of all police. And you're like, that's not at all what I said.
Yeah.
As a, like, people are like, oh, like, policing is just rooted in slave patrols. I'm like, they have police in like Burundi and a host of other countries. Like, you can look it up. But policing exists everywhere. That's how you do society. But I do think, like, the way in which criminal justice reform and policing became what I would say culture ward. Like, there were moments, and I think that if anyone remember, I mean, you go back and because 2020, it's not just the murder of George Floyd, it's the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and the murder of
Mhm.
Breonna Taylor. And that all
Mhm.
happens like within how people learned about it came within like pretty shortish
Yeah.
periods of time. And like all very different cases, but from like an internet perspective, it seemed to happen all very close together, especially for a lot of people. Ahmaud Arbery, that only comes out because the fucking idiots who murdered him were like, here's the video, we love it, of chasing this man down the street. And so you had this like 3 horrible instances and people responding to it, not with like well-reasoned policy, because these are 3 very different instances, but with like culture war stuff about like the end of policing and talking a lot about black and brown bodies in a way that was weird to me. And so I think that something that's been interesting to me though is that like it's very difficult to decouple social justice issues, like actual social justice issues, like um, reducing instances of simultaneous over policing and under policing, because so many communities experience it where it's like if you call the cops because your car's gotten broken into, nobody shows up, but there's always a cop sitting outside your block just in case somebody sneezes too loud or something like that. Like there are
Mhm.
lots of communities that live under that weird tension. And you want to separate that from like you're like, oh, I want the police to do stuff, I just don't want them to do the stuff they're not supposed to do, which I don't think seems that
Mhm.
hard to figure out. And then you get into like prison reform, which a lot of like right leaning institutions were very like right on crime, very supportive of prison reform and a
Yep.
bunch of other issues. But once those issues become culture ward, once that becomes like when you once people start assuming that when you're talking about social justice that you're just being some fucking freak on the internet, it's really hard to decouple those, especially because the language of social justice so quickly, as it often does, overtook what we're actually trying to do. Like it overtook thinking about the murder of Tony Timpa, thinking about the ways in which like the groups hit hardest by police are Native American communities. You can look at the numbers of police shootings, say, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so I think that that's been something that I actually don't know what that will look like in the future. I think that Obama tried to get
I
to it
mean,
'cause
do you
in
think
the
there's any like hope of a course correction that like there is going to be a more sensible way of
I think there can
talking
be,
about
but I
it
think that
and we can get
well,
back to
okay.
that like 20 I don't know 2015 moment where it's like Rand Paul is going to be the guy who
Oh man.
brings criminal justice reform from the right, like that was a real moment.
Yeah, it
Like
really
is
was a moment.
there
I just remember
yeah.
though, like I talked to Senator Tim Scott on this issue, and I talked about him about like qualified immunity. And he was like, well, we'll never go for that. It just will never go for that. And I'm like, like majority of police are indemnified against individual set like if I even think about this too long, I will get really annoyed. But I think that it's been interesting, and I actually don't know how to get and what a course correction would look like, because I think that you have, and I think Obama tried to get there of just being like, we want cops to serve their communities in good ways, which I'm just like, yeah, that's it. That's basically it. We want police to do their jobs, and when they are not doing their jobs, we want them to be punished in the way that anyone would be. We want them to be thought of in the, like, as employees of the state who are working on behalf of the people of the state. And it's been hard when that issue has gotten, like, it's funny because you keep having these moments, and it always happens after something fucking terrible, in which you see people for a second, like after Uvalde, being like, wow, the police just stood out there and let those kids die and they didn't do anything. And then you remind them, like, yeah, the Supreme Court actually says they don't have a duty to do anything. And you see people like, oh, maybe we should do something about this issue. And you're like, yeah. Obviously, it's after something terrible. And then you go back and then it's like, no, Blue Lives Matter. Cops can do whatever they want, except to me. And so I don't know how that decoupling will take place, because I think, like, it's so hard once something becomes culture warred to pull it out of culture war. The only thing that seems to really make that happen is time. Like, I keep thinking about, like, big culture issues of, like, when I was in high school or college, or younger. Like, I think about this a lot with, like, rap music. Do you remember, like, the 90s? People were very worried about violent rap music, and now
Oh
Snoop
yeah,
is, like,
parental
America's
guidance
uncle.
warnings. Yeah.
Yeah, people were very worried about this, and people had to go to Congress, and it was a whole thing. People also were very worried about violent video games. And, like, the
For
only
gore,
thing
baby.
the the only thing that seems to make this better is time. And that's all I've
Yeah.
got.
Yeah. Well, I think that's fair, and I hope that that time does heal some of those wounds. We are coming up on time now,
Mhm.
so I want to throw the last question of the show at you, which is thematically relevant to our show, and it is, Jane, what is a
Mhm.
question that you think more people should be asking?
That is a really I'm doing the stalling thing. Whenever anyone says, "That's a really good question," they are stalling, and I am stalling. I think the question everyone should be asking is, what is something like, I cannot make people be less politicized. I have no power in that manner. But
Mhm.
I would like people to be asking themselves, what can I be doing outside of politics or the conversation about politics that would benefit my family, my life, and my community? Um, how can I be a less political entity?
Hmm.
I think a lot about, like, something that I really like about Twitter. Um, and I'm aware it's, like, very popular to talk about how it's like a hellhole, and I'm like, it really can be. The anti-Semites, whew, they are jumping
Yeah.
out. But something I like
Let's
is, like,
show some respect. It's X, Jane. But continue.
maybe I'm like one of those pre-Vatican II people where I'm just like, nope, we just, no, it just didn't
Yes, the
happen.
Twitter hipsters will never call it X. So go ahead.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
But I think that something I've really enjoyed is, like, when you get to know someone who has very different political views from you, but you actually are, like, on this other subject, really, like, pretty in kind. I think about, there's a writer, Jeffrey Blahar, who writes for National Review, where he also hosts a music podcast. And I've gone on to talk to him about Nine Inch Nails and Jimi Hendrix. And someday I will get the Bob Marley episode. Someday they will let me wax what rhapsodic about Bob
Bob
Marley for
Marley,
like an hour and
famous
a half.
Catholic. Later in
Um,
life.
and so I think that that's been something in which, like, and social media is inherently flattening. So people just become their politics, and then people try to live into that of just being like, I'm gonna wake up at 9 a.m. and scream about how I think that the vice president's daughter looks weird. Like, no, go, like, get really excited about, like, a movie or a type of movie, or, like, that's why I'm like, I will never make fun of people who are super into, like, anime or something like that. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, go do that. Like, what is something you can do to make yourself less politicized?
I wonder
I
if this
love that.
stems from your love of sports, Jane. Like, I feel like to some degree, there's this theory that's long been trotted out that's like, for the nerds, they could have sports like normal people do. Instead, they have politics. And the more we move toward treating politics as sport, the worse off we all are. And so
Yep.
simply
No,
pick
it
a
is
sport,
genuinely
right?
the worst. Like, treating politics like sports is the stupidest. Like, it treats politics as if there's an end point, as if this is like a weird game, as if they're like,
Good team,
no,
bad
no.
team, victory, loss. Like, it's
Yes,
like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So don't do that.
Yeah.
Just, I don't
Make the
know,
NBA
get a
great.
hobby.
Yeah. All right, Jane, thank you so much for talking
Absolutely.
to us. This was fascinating. We'll see you all next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking
Thank
Questions.
you guys so much. I'm aware
These
that went late. I am
conversations
so
appear on
sorry.
Reason's YouTube channel and the Just Asking Questions podcast feed every Thursday. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate and review the show.